Every civilization leaves behind traces of what it valued. Its stories, its knowledge, its way of understanding the world. Today we live in a world of unprecedented intelligence. Information moves faster than ever before, yet many societies struggle to answer a simpler question. Who are we becoming? Horizon explores a foundational idea. What if culture is not simply part of society, but the foundation beneath it? Welcome to Horizon, the Council for Culture, Intelligence and Human Continuity, presented by the Age of Culture Project.
Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are watching this from. My name is Michael Frugtniet, and this is the opening reflection of a series of conversations that we're calling the Horizon Foundational Dialogue Series. I want to begin plainly. We're living through a strange moment, not simply a difficult moment, not simply a noisy moment, but a strange one. What does that mean? Well, on the surface, it looks like the systems around us are not collapsing. In many ways, they're becoming more efficient. Governments have more data than ever before. Companies have more tools. Universities produce more research, and technology moves faster each year. We all know the great sort of innovation curve that says we'll have twice as many innovations in half as much time. Well, that's going asymptotically or infinitely at the moment. So technology is really driving, in fact, innovation socially. Artificial intelligence can now write, translate, summarize, diagnose patterns, generate images, teach, classify, recommend and increasingly mediate how we see the world. And yet, despite all of this, despite all of these advantages, something's clearly not working. Trust is thin. We are, after all, people. We're human beings. Public confidence in institutions is fragile. Young people are anxious about the future. Families are struggling to hold continuity across generations. Lately, in Australia, there's been talk of taxing boomers to give the younger generation a break. Now, that's probably not the only country thinking of doing that. France equally talked about a 9,000 billion nest egg that's sitting, waiting to be transferred from one generation to the next over the next 20 years. That is creating opportunity, but it's also creating tension between the generations. So countries are increasingly what binds them together? Communities speak past one another. Education is often reduced to, will this get me a job, employability? Technology is too often treated as destiny. Education is reduced, as I said, to employability, and technology is there as a sort of crutch. Politics becomes performance, and culture, the very thing that societies have memory, meaning, gives it meaning, discipline, imagination, restraint and direction, is treated either as entertainment, heritage, identity, or a battlefield. Often it's pegged up in a certain corner and regarded as something elite. But that's not what culture is. Culture is so much more general and so much more widespread. Because of all of this, something is not working. But we want to make it work. It's not a small problem. It's a problem beneath many of the problems. This series, we're beginning to attempt to examine the problem seriously. Not with slogans, not with outrage, not with the usual choreography of people pretending to disagree on camera while quietly agreeing not to go too deeply. We want to ask difficult questions. What if many of our systems are not failing because they are broken? Or rather, they are failing, or are they broken? What if they're producing exactly the same outcomes as they were designed to produce, but those outcomes are not in fact in line with what we should be looking for? And if that's true, then the real question is not simply how to repair the system, it's whether we've built a system around the right ideas, the right values, and the right notion of being a human being. And that's where the series begins. Let me set the terrain. For roughly the past century, especially since the middle of the 20th century, we've lived inside what Dr. Paul Schaefer has described as the economic age. Paul's work, which will form the foundation of our first conversation after this introduction, has argued many years that economics became not only one discipline among others, but the dominant organizing logic of society. It's the society of production, it's the society of wealth creation. That is worth pausing on. As much as economics matter, and markets matter, and productivity matters, jobs matter, trade matters, no serious person would deny that. The problem is when economics stops being a tool and becomes the whole dominant philosophy of a civilization. When the value of a person is quietly measured by output, when the value of education is measured by labour market return, when the value of culture is measured by tourism, branding, consumption, or contribution to GDP, when the value of a community is judged whether it is competitive, not whether it is coherent, and whether the value of time is measured by whether it is productive, not whether it is meaningful. This is not a left-wing or a right-wing idea. It's deeper than that. It's about people, it's about humanity. Both modern left and modern right in different ways have often accepted the same underlying premise that the economy is the main stage and everything else has to justify itself in terms of economic returns or economic value. The left may speak more about distribution, the right may speak more about wealth creation and growth, but both often remain trapped in the same house. What Paul Schaefer has been saying for decades is the house itself may be too small. Culture, in its fullest sense, is not simply art, music, food, festivals, heritage, or museums. They're expressions of culture. They matter deeply. Culture is larger than that. It's a bit like the social glue that keeps us together. Culture is the way a society understands life. It's how it forms people. It's how it remembers. It's how it mourns. It's how it celebrates. It's how it teaches children what is admirable and what is shameful. It is how it decides what should be preserved and what should be allowed to change. It's how people learn to belong without being absorbed and to differ without being exiled. Culture is the operating system beneath those institutions. And it's something that is the backbone of many societies, but it's neglected. And here's the uncomfortable part. We've spent decades upgrading the visible machinery while neglecting the operating system. And this is why this series matters. We need to be honest as to where we are. The world is not short of crises. It's short of interpretation. There's war in Europe. That war is deep and the instability in the Middle East is exacerbating global tensions. There is a hardening of geopolitical blocs. There is a return of the great power competition. We thought the Cold War was finished, and then Russia has emerged from the ashes, so to speak, to be yet another counterweight to the United States. We're moving back into a bipolar world, even though the wish of the rest of the world is to avoid that and stay in a multipolar world. There's a weaponization of information. There's immigration pressures. There's demographic pressures. There's ecological and environmental pressures. And the digital environment has changed human attention faster than our institutions can understand. By the end of 2024, the UNHCR reported that around 120 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. It's not an abstraction. These are real numbers with real people. It's a civilizational signal. It means that vast numbers of people are being torn from their homes, their memories, their language, their burial grounds, their neighborhoods, their schools, and they lose that continuity or risk losing that continuity. International IDEA's Global State of Democracy in 2024 found that for 8 consecutive years, more countries have declined in democratic quality than improved. 1 in 4 countries is moving towards a type of dictatorship or loss of democracy, and 4 in 9 are worse off. That's not a small administrative problem. It tells us that legitimacy itself is under pressure. So across the OECD, a rich man's club, the 2024 survey on trust found that 44% of people reported low or no trust in national governments, compared with 39% reporting high or moderately high trust. Trust is not a sentimental matter. It's the oxygen of collective life. It's what makes our democratic institutions work. Without it, even competent systems begin to feel alien and start to crumble. And then, of course, there's technology. The Edelman Trust Barometer found that most institutions are not trusted to introduce innovations into society. Even business, the most trusted in that category, sits just below 60%. the threshold used by Edelman to define trust. Media is actively distrusted, and trust in innovation is not keeping pace with the innovation itself. Hence the debate we hear about AI. Where is it taking us? What's it going to do? Have we lost our essence as human beings? Is humanity threatened? So this is the environment to which artificial intelligence is arriving. It's not arriving into a stable society. It's not arriving into a settled moral order. It's not arriving into a culture that knows what it wants to preserve, which is a real issue when you think of the scope, dimension, and potential of what AI can do. But it's not enough to ask what AI can do. We have to ask what kind of human being it assumes we are, what kind of child it forms, what kind of teacher it displaces or supports, what kind of child can flourish with AI, and what kind of memory it keeps. So it's a kind of culture that makes a future feel inevitable, and we're not really sure where that future is headed. This brings us to one more difficult question in the series. If culture is so weak structurally, when everybody claims to value it, why? Every government says culture matters. Every city wants a cultural strategy. Every corporation wants diversity. Every school wants creativity. And every tourism board wants heritage. Every platform wants content. But when serious decisions are made, budgets, institutional design, technology governance, education reform, migration policy, or urban planning, culture is usually somewhere near the end of the table. And yet it's this, as I said before, a social glue that can pull all of these things together in a coherent fashion. So as long as it's ignored and left at the end of the table, that's the problem. Culture has to some extent become boxed in. It's been made safe, decorative, measurable, fundable, or even harmless. We call it the arts. We call it identity. We call it heritage. We call it the creative industry. But we rarely call it what it is. It's a system through which human beings become capable of living together. Now, UNESCO, a multilateral organisation, has described culture as a global public good, something that builds communities, fosters cultural diversity and mutual understanding. It helps address exclusion. That language matters because it begins to move culture out of the decorative category into the domain of public responsibility. Because culture is a public good, then we have to ask ourselves, who governs it? Well, no one controls it or governs it. Those are different things, control and to govern. Control says you must think this. Governance asks what conditions allow meaning, memory, difference and continuity to survive. Control imposes, governance holds. The difference is important. Let me address something directly because it sits beneath a great deal of political noise. Multiculturalism is not the problem. The understanding of what assimilation is the problem. Or more precisely, compulsory assimilation. They demand that people erase themselves in order to belong to a society that is integrated. It is amnesia with paperwork. When my father and mother came to Australia after the Second World War, they came from another country with another culture, with other languages to Australia. They came at a time when the policy was in fact assimilation. But they didn't erase themselves because there were hundreds of thousands of other people like them in Australia. However, they knew that there were codes that they needed to respect. They knew that there was a law of the land that they needed to respect. And they wanted to do everything they could to build their new life in Australia cohesively, coherently, and fluidly. That doesn't mean they erased themselves. It just meant they respected there was a cultural topography, if you like, between the public and the private. And a mature society shouldn't ask people to abandon their memory at the border. It should ask something harder and better. Can we build a shared civic life strong enough to hold difference without dissolving into fragmentation? That's the real problem. And that is, in fact, the real problem of multiculturalism. Not problem, but challenge. Multiculturalism is at best not a lazy celebration of everything. It's not flags, food festivals, and slogans. It's the discipline of work, of living together with real difference under a shared civic frame. Under a common roof, the society can be called the house, and multiculturalism are the tenants in that house, but they understand how to coexist in that house in a coherent way. So what do we owe one another when we do not come from the same history? What must be shared or what must remain distinct? what should be learned and what should be protected? All these questions are vital because we talk very much about cultural heritage. We talk very much about immigrants and newcomers to certain countries maintaining their cultures and traditions. That can be in conflict with the local society, the local traditions and the local culture. So how do you make it coherent? The failure of many societies has not been too much culture, it's been too little cultural seriousness. We have often confused diversity management with cultural understanding. And I would also say there's another thing here that gets in the way. We like to build hierarchies around culture, and those hierarchies play a very unhelpful role in displacing one culture for another. That's not how multiculturalism should work. Multiculturalism has the host culture, which arguably should be a dominant, not in any warfaring way, but in terms of clarity. And around that tree trunk of that culture, the other cultures coexist in harmony to enrich the civic society and living in that particular place. The question is whether we can talk about all of those things without hysteria. A society does need a shared language. It does need shared norms. It does need shared loyalties and shared responsibilities. I think one of the touching things one sees today is when you see a country like Australia, full of immigrants, when there is a football match they're behind Australia. And I think one of the most beautiful scenes in recent cinematographic history was the story of Invictus, the South African rugby union team, when they were allowed back in. Nelson Mandela walked around the spectators, and most of the South Africans were carrying the old South African flag. But there was a group of white South Africans carrying the new ones. And he stopped and he asked them, he said, "Why do you fly that flag?" And the white South African said, "Because it's the flag of my country." He achieved something that cultural harmony could only wish for. In a potpourri country such as South Africa, Nelson Mandela brought culture together under a notion of national identity. So just to talk about why we call this horizon. The horizon is something that we can see beyond. We can't see beyond it, but we know it's there. It's a destination without being an arrival place. It's something that can shape our thinking into progressiveness, into advancement, and into a notion that things can be better if we continue to work towards a goal. And that's a good basis for social peace. So that's where I want to take a sort of politically aware point without being partisan. It's okay to pick sides, but sometimes it's not always helpful to pick sides. It's always good to be neutral at times as well. Across much of the West, and increasingly beyond it, politics has become a substitute for culture. This is dangerous. It means that politics are bounded. People have family, they have faith, they have neighbourhood, they have craft, they have associations, music, memory, etc. And this gives the entire community meaning. Politics matters, but it doesn't have to carry the entire weight of all of those things. When culture weakens, politics becomes the religion without mercy, and everything becomes a moral emergency. Every disagreement becomes a question of identity. Every institution becomes an opportunity for a battlefield, and every election becomes existential. It doesn't have to be that way. An election, yes, there are important decisions to make. Yes, there are certain outcomes to see, but it does not mean that the election outcome is going to be an existential crisis. That's the beauty of culture as the social glue. It can help bring these things together. So that's the healthy thing about democracy and when culture functions. A functioning society needs politics, but it cannot live by politics alone. So let's come back to the question I asked before. Why horizon and why now? Maybe because we need a horizon. It's not a brand. It's not an organization. Well, not yet. It's an orientation. It's headed to the future. It's headed a line of sight. It's headed to somewhere over in the famous Wizard of Oz film, over the rainbow. It's a little bit like that. What's over the horizon? We don't know, but we want to get there. It's a journey. And the idea is to look beyond the immediate to the next phase, something that we don't know, but something we can shape. And so Horizon asks us, where is this going? What sort of civilization will it produce? What kind of human being does want this as a reward? What kind of truth does this protect? And what kind of stranger does this welcome? The hard questions that we have are those about children, elderly people, strangers, and truth. Over the course of this series, we'll not pretend to answer them all. That would be both ambitious and absurd. What we do want to do is deal with this intangible notion of culture, sculpt the fog, so to speak. It's intangible, but it's there. We're dealing something that's real, but it's not fully formed, and it's dynamic. Everyone feels it. Very few can describe it, and it's very hard to get your hands around it completely. So we're going to take a step-by-step approach. After this introductory reflection, I'm going to sit down with Dr. Paul Schaefer for a foundational conversation on the cultural age. Paul's work gives us the intellectual centre of gravity. He's spent decades arguing that the economic age, while historically powerful, is no longer adequate as the organising frame for humanity's future. I would argue that people now talk about the information age. We also don't want the information age to be the next framework for humanity. We've got plenty of information. What we need to understand is what makes us function as human beings. And we're going to explore what he means by culture, why this transition matters, and what must be preserved as we move forward. Then we'll turn to the question of systems. Now, systems, what exactly do we mean? We talk about the system is the system is functioning, but society is not. So there's a bit of a disconnect. We'll examine whether all of these crises and these failures in execution are of design or are they inherent. Mira Sartika and Nancy Duxbury will help us think through social systems, culture, governance, communities, and the conditions under which societies can become coherent or fragmented. Then we'll return to value. Value is a very economic notion. In fact, it's one of the issues that we have as human beings, that we try to reduce everything to value. So in the fiction of value, the episode after that, Diane Dodd and Thomas Legrand will help us examine what happens when value is defined too narrowly. Food, ecology, heritage, community, meaning, care, these things are often treated as secondary because we can't put a monetary tag on them. If you can't put a price tag on something, it can't be worth anything, and it's too difficult to measure economically. But perhaps they're not secondary at all. In fact, they're not secondary at all. They are primary. They're pillars of society. Perhaps they are the foundation. Then we'll turn to culture itself. The notion that of Peter Musafaridis and Nancy Duxbury and Susan Maximum, they will discuss that has culture been domesticated? Now, I think about that as, has culture become boxed in? Has it now been sort of pushed into corner as being something elite, something, the fine arts, so to speak? But culture is so much more. Culture pops up in society over all places. Peter will bring the perspective of cultural diversity, mapping at scale. Nancy will bring deep cultural policy insights, and Susan will bring the neuroaesthetic and human development lens, reminding us that art and culture are not ornamental. They're connected to how humans think, feel, learn, recover, and develop. We could talk a lot about neuroplasticity and the role, in fact, of culture in shaping that neuroplasticity. And I'm sure Susan will bring that up as well. Then we'll turn to technology, the automation of the human. Susan Magzaman and Japhus Doswell will help us ask what happens when digital systems become shaping attention, memory, cognition, behaviour, and identity. And of course, this is very topical these days because we talk all the time about the internet. We talk all the time about artificial intelligence, and we worry that the next generation will have forgotten how to think independently. So I think the automation of the human is also about the automation of our thinking and cognitive processes in a very meaningful and deep analysis that we will look at. And then finally, we'll return back to Dr. Paul Schaefer with a closing reflection, the horizon settlements. What has become clearer? It's not a conclusion in the final sense. It's more like a first settlement of the tone, sort of a plant a stake, plant a flag in the ground and say, okay, this is where we're at. Where do we go from here? What's become clearer? We take stock, we do an inventory. What tensions remain? And what would a serious cultural framework need to do? What should it avoid becoming? And what kind of work should follow? It's not a campaign. It's not a conference. It's not a panel series. It's a serious inquiry. The latest speaker guide frames the series in exactly this way, as recorded editorial dialogue rather than a live panel or promotional webinar, with each episode feeding into analytical summaries and a final Horizon foundational report ready mid-July. Who's this for? We believe it's for educators who know that schooling cannot be reduced to just credentials. It's for policymakers who sense that regulation without culture and an understanding of the society beneath them or above them, it needs to have this as a backbone. It's for technologists who understand that building powerful systems without human philosophy is reckless and can be dangerous. And it's for artists and cultural leaders who are tired of being treated as decorative. As I said before, they're boxed into the fine arts box. There's so much more. They're expressions of culture. They actually allow us to take the temperature of a society, but we've put them in a box as a decorative addition to society. And perhaps it's also for parents who worry that their children are growing up too connected to the internet and failing to understand the importance of disconnecting. And yet they're rooted in very little. They don't have deep roots. They flit and float. The attention span of children these days is around 7 seconds. So parents worry about that because how will the children cope in the real world tomorrow if they can't concentrate, focus on anything longer than 7 seconds? It's for civic leaders and philanthropists, universities and cultural institutions, even public agencies. Anyone who understands that the next great challenge is not simply innovation, it's formation. And what forms us? What deforms us? What reforms us? Those are the questions. Let's be clear about what this series is not. It's not anti-technology, it's not anti-economics, it's not anti-globalization, and it's not anti-diversity. It's not nostalgia. Nostalgia is too easy. It remembers very selectively and forgives too quickly. It's not a utopian exercise, as much as utopia would like to have the greatest good for the greatest number. That's not the objective, because utopias are usually hostile to reality. It's something more practical. It's an argument recovering the whole, putting economics back in its proper place, and putting technology under human judgment and human values. The tone of the series will not be hysterical, but it will be frank. Because political vagueness is no longer enough, and because we keep saying systems are under pressure, without asking what those systems are for. We cannot keep saying IA will transform everything without asking who is doing the transforming, by what authority, towards what end. And we cannot keep saying diversity is our strength without doing the harder work of building the cultural conditions under which diversity actually becomes a strength rather than fragmentation. A prime minister in Australia once described the multiculturalism in Australia as a danger of tribalism. And he said he didn't want his children to grow up in a nation of hyphenated Australians, Greco-Australian, Italo-Australian, Sino-Australian. In his view, everyone is Australian, but there was a cultural wealth beneath that tag that was brought in by all of the contributions made by other cultures. And I think that's where we would like to go if we want to talk about multiculturalism. We can't keep saying that education matters either, while removing education, the very things that make people capable of judgment, of history, literature, music, etc., memory and encounter. Education does matter, but we're not investing by putting the investment into these things that I just said, history, literature, philosophy, etc., because they're very difficult to put a price tag on. They don't contribute to the economic age, and yet they're incredibly important as to the nature and constitution of the human being. We can't continue to say that trust is declining, as though trust is a communication problem. Trust declines when people feel that institutions no longer understand the reality they live in. And in countries where voting is not compulsory, such as many European countries, I think it's an interesting barometer. How much trust does the electorate have in the government when the participation rates in voting fall below 50%? Australia's a different story. Australia's compulsory voting, so you typically have participation in excess of 90%. Does that mean that there's trust? Not necessarily, but you drag the voters kicking and screaming to a voting booth to have their say. And at least having their say, part of our culture, having their say allows them to express in one way or another whether there's trust or no trust. When people don't even turn up to the voting booth, you have a real catastrophe. You don't know what degree of trust has gone, what degree of trust exists. So trust is not restored by better messaging. It's restored by better alignment between what institutions say, what they do, and what people know to be true. There's a French saying, il faut appeler un chat un chat. Call a cat a cat, or some people say in English, call a spade a spade. But we don't do that anymore. We don't like to call things by their name. not. It's for some reason we don't want to call things for what they are. It's not aggression, it's not crudity, it's just honesty. And if a society has no shared story, then say so. If an education system has become too instrumental and too mercantile, say so. If technology is becoming deployed faster than the cultural consequences are understood, say so. And if culture is being reduced to simply content of the decorative nature, we should say so. So politics, to some extent, has swallowed meaning. And we should say that also. If people are lonely, they're uprooted, they're overstimulated, they're underformed and suspicious of institutions, we should say so. And that's the serious work. Not complain, to begin naming, to begin conversations that can change things. Once that's understood, it can be governed. Once it can be governed, it can be renewed. And the word culture has become overused and understood. Some hear it and think of museums or film festivals. Some think of it and talk about ethnicity, about languages, about elite taste. It's more basic than that. Culture is how human beings have inhabited this world for thousands of years. And culture evolves, it's dynamic. It's the difference between place and space. It's as I said before, it's the social glue that keeps us together. So between food and meal, between sound and music, between shelter and home, between information and wisdom, population and people, coexistence and common life, there's a cultural denominator there that makes us, or allows us rather, to understand what we want to do, how we exist, and how we need to interact with each other. It's not enough. It's probably never going to be enough to fill this vacuum, which is filled at the moment by markets, algorithms, bureaucracies, and political anger. And that's a real concern. But it's a start. So why now? Because the speed of change is faster than the depth of formation. AI is forcing questions on cultural institutions that should have been asked long ago. Young people in particular, are being asked to prepare for a future that we can't explain. We don't know what the future will be. And trust is no longer assumed. As I said before, participation rates in elections has fallen to all-time lows. And that is potentially a barometer of the level of trust in many societies. You also have migration, displacement, plural societies, a lack of or loss of identity, to some extent sacrificed on the altar of diversity, when that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just happens with no guidance or no deliberation. And that is causing hostility, it's causing tension, and it's causing issues for politicians and policymakers to address. So I'm just pausing there to think about that question, because culture is, we often talked about wars being something that would often squabble over square kilometres here and there. If you think of the conflicts going on at the moment, even if you look at Ukraine's Russia, as much as Russia has sort of said they want Ukrainian territory, why do the Ukrainians resist so much? It's cultural. They're not Russians. They don't believe themselves to be Russians. The Ukrainian language is different from the Russian language. Even the Ukrainian religion is slightly different to the Russian religion. There's a pride in the Ukrainian people. In the crisis of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, with the Tamils and the Sinhalese, why did the Sinhalese become so hostile, and were so brutal, so to speak, with the Tamil separatists? Because when you have a small island of 23 million people hanging just below a continent of 1.3 billion, and there's a strait between you, you don't fear necessarily invasion, but you do fear cultural annihilation. And that's why cultural wars are so much more than advertising slogans. It's what people fight about. It's why Europe is being torn apart at the moment by unbridled, ungoverned, and uncontrolled migration that doesn't fit the social, cultural, or political norms of what the Europeans actually want to have. It's been forced upon them by circumstance. And it needs to be addressed not just politically, but culturally. So let me end where I began. We're not facing a shortage of intelligence. We have intelligence everywhere. There's data, there's systems, there's God knows what. We have intelligence everywhere. Machine intelligence, market intelligence, military intelligence. It's everywhere. What we lack is cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence is the ability to understand what things mean, not just how they work. The ability to interpret humans, your human systems across time, not merely optimizing them in the present for the sake of productivity. It's the ability to hold difference without dissolving into chaos. There's nothing wrong with difference. There is a problem with hostility and chaos. And culture can allow us to reconcile those two ends. It's also the notion that we can use technology without dissolving, without being subordinate to it. And that's part of the conversation that we're having now with Horizon. And that'll be the beginning of the series. We won't settle all of this in a few conversations. We may begin to see what's missing. We may begin to recover the language for something that many people already feel was there, but we didn't put a name to it. And perhaps by the end, we'll have the beginnings of a Horizon view. Not an ideology, not a slogan, but a disciplined cultural consciousness of the age in which we are living and in which we are entering. That is the Horizon Foundation Dialogue series. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully can we carry this responsibility together to the beyond the horizon.